Hello everyone, my name is Jessica Stokes. I work at the Royal Agriculture University with Lisa Van Dyke. And recently, back in September, we led a webinar on facilitating farmer-led innovation. Now, this was a joint webinar hosted by the Arachnos Project, which are the series of podcasts that we're presenting now, and the Flynn Network. Now, the Flynn Network is a farmer-led innovation network in the UK, and it's a group of organisations who advocate funding for and practising farmer-led research, development and innovation. Now, at our webinar back in September, we had a real diverse range of participants. We had researchers interested in regenerative farming and agricultural development. We had industry representatives, facilitators, advisory services, welfare organisations, farmers, vets, environmentalists, project managers, even microbiologists, and a journalist joining us from across the UK, Europe, and even Australia. Now, the objectives of the webinar were to showcase emerging tools and tips for facilitating farmer-led innovation, both online and in the field. And our keynote speaker was Russ Carrington, former General Manager at the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, who are a grassroots farmer-led movement practicing and advocating regenerative farming in the UK. Now, Russ is pathologically passionate about all things sustainable and regenerative, particularly within the food and farming movement. And we both believe in facilitation as a tool to support farmers, or indeed any group of people who want to come together to collaborate around providing solutions to current local, national and global issues. So Russ, would you like to start by telling us a bit about what you covered in the keynote talk on facilitating farmer-led innovation and why?
Hi Jess, thanks very much for the introduction. And yeah, it was really great to speak on the webinar and really good discussions afterwards as well. But principally what I discussed and shared was my experiences of managing the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, and in the process of that, actually helping so many farmers through a sort of transition towards pasture-fed and regenerative farming techniques. And through that, I really began to understand the importance of facilitation. So I shared some of my experiences with doing that and some of the psychology behind actually farmer change and who ultimately is leading and driving that, and how facilitators can help that along, but also do it in a way that really empowers farmers to drive the change that they want to see.
Fantastic. Okay, so you said that there were some good discussions and some kind of interactive sessions within the webinar. Have you got anything that you would like to share as a result of the discussion that kind of changed your attitudes towards this subject, or any kind of reflections of things that you learned or took away from the webinar?
Yeah, it was really interesting to hear from different people that were both watching, listening, and also speaking on the panel, and actually how much we had in common. Although we'd all sort of come to the same conclusions independently, actually we were all finding similar experience. And I think one thing that struck me, which was shared by a group in New Zealand that were working on farmer facilitation, they introduced me to the Bennett's hierarchy, which is a tool for assessing the effectiveness of facilitation and outreach programs. And it kind of looks at how you can measure that particular programs are being effective or not. And so it starts to measure how deeply you see change happening, whether that's just simply participation in activities and coming along and kicking the tires and drinking tea and eating cake and kind of listening, or whether it's genuine behavioural change by some of the farmers, and then actually the results of that being changes to their farm businesses and radical improvements towards different metrics for sustainability. So that was a really interesting takeaway I took that was sort of quite well used down in Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, so that kind of concept of facilitation being something that can actually evoke kind of small, kind of low-hanging fruit, as I call it, changes, as well as kind of working as it kind of works in more towards kind of systemic changes on the farm or behavioural changes on the farm for the farmer. It's got kind of multiple routes, hasn't it, into making changes, whether it's kind of small actions or the way people start to look at their farm and perceive what's going on their farm longer term.
That's right. But the other thing that was, I think it was one thing I shared, but again, it was interesting to hear it confirmed by others, is that different techniques and different facilitation is required for different audiences, and kind of depending on where farmers or anybody is on sort of on the change journey, as it were, and are they sort of early on in the change journey, or are they quite far and getting quite committed to new ways of working? And actually, depending where people are on that change journey, and I referenced the Kubler-Ross change curve, which is kind of a theoretical model for how people actually deal with bad news or deal with grief, but nonetheless many similar principles for any change, be that positive or negative. And it was interesting to sort of think that there's a need to give different audiences different types of facilitation. Well, the same principles of facilitation, but sort of present things in different ways, and just be aware that different people are in different places on that change journey, and then it can make sure that what is done, what is facilitated, the activities that are done are actually most relevant for where that group are.
Yeah, that's really key. I think the facilitator's role is actually being the kind of glue and gel and almost like the antennae of the group as to where they are on that change journey. And as you say, the facilitator's role is to pick up on that and be flexible as to what is needed by the group, rather than kind of the other way around. Okay.
That's right, yeah.
So would you like to give some, because I know in your talk you gave some examples of the kinds of kind of ways in which you facilitated farmer-led innovation and kind of knowledge exchange before us. Would you like to give us some examples of how you kind of use tools, particularly kind of on farm, and also I know that the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association and others are now using kind of online forums to kind of complement and support what you facilitate in the kind of real world on farm. Would you like to kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so what we've done at the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association was to, because we were a very spread out group of farmers, we started 10 years ago with just a dozen of us, and we were all over the country, and so we needed some way of easily connecting, and so we had a Google group forum, which is a kind of email-based forum, and it was a really great way for us to quickly connect and stay in touch on a national scale. And then as the group of farmers grew and we became an organisation in our own right, we kept that Google group forum, and it's turned into a real hive of activity, of daily exchange between farmers, talking not just about what the organisation is doing, but about the farming systems that they're all working towards and how to get better at it, and ask for advice and share success stories and try and make trade deals together. And that's worked really well quite on its own. And there are many people on that forum. There's 600 plus members of the organisation on that forum now, but there's many of those that have actually never met face to face. So we've got this kind of really interesting online community that has developed. But it has been really helped by face-to-face meetings. So we used to do study tours and farm visits and other face-to-face talks. And those, together with an online platform, really gelled very well, and they felt very suitable, given that farming's quite an isolating industry. Farmers are often in remote places and isolated. So it was a way of actually addressing isolation and bringing people together, and making those connections between physical meetups, such as the Oxford Real Farming Conference in the UK once a year, just kind of keep some momentum, keep some conversations rolling throughout the year. And it's, since we've had the impacts of COVID, haven't obviously been able to do any face-to-face meetings, but we've continued to replace them with webinars. and other online meetings on Zoom and other platforms where we can kind of just keep up that momentum online. And it's almost like farmers are far more used to that now than they were, say, even 5 years ago, to kind of have that interface online and over the internet, whereas they might have traditionally got that interface and knowledge exchange at the livestock market, or in the pub, or on the road. They might pass another farmer and stop and have a chat. So this is it's interesting to see how this culture of online exchange is really mainstream now, actually.
Yes, and yeah, particularly this year, given how the world is, well, in particular, changed this year, I think it's encouraging going forward. So just thinking about the world we live in at the moment and the kind of multiple challenges that particularly the food and farming industry face with regards to feeding a growing population, climate change, ecological breakdown, Brexit, and now COVID. How do you feel about this process in order to be kind of applicable to helping to solve and promote and support farmers in their kind of change journeys in order to be more kind of sustainable and resilient in the future?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think all of the things you've listed are absolutely key. But I think the really big worry for farmers at the moment is what's going to happen to farm subsidies as we leave the EU, or as we leave the common agricultural policy rather, and what becomes of our farm business models, which are perhaps unfortunately at the moment highly dependent on farm subsidies. And so as we transition to a domestic agricultural policy in the UK, we are going to be having our farm subsidies reduced and hopefully replaced by something else, but that's all very unclear at the moment. And it's likely that within the next 5 years, that's going to result in some really major changes in successful business models for farming. And that could have huge impacts. And so there's going to be not a farmer in the country that's going to have to deal with quite a substantial change that is imposed. And it just makes this whole conversation all the more relevant, in my opinion, around how farmers are supported through that change. And I would say, in my sort of anecdotal experience at the moment, there are a good number of farmers that are really stepping up and pioneering and really thinking about how they can work differently, how they can transition their business models to be less reliant on farm subsidies and to garner more profit or more margin, or do things differently or diversify. And that's absolutely great to see. But there are these other audiences, as I mentioned earlier, about different people on different parts of the path that aren't really addressing any of this yet. And I think they're going to have quite a sharp wake-up call at some point. And perhaps the role of facilitating them is going to be even more crucial, because they could really use a lot of support, but supported in a way that is not telling them what to do or advising them what to do, but actually morally supporting them to bring these things to their attention and work together to figure out how they can help their businesses to become more financially sustainable, but also ecologically and socially sustainable as well, as to address all those other issues that you mentioned there. And that's going to really matter in certain areas of the UK, because there are some areas of real farming poverty, actually, where there are very limited options on what crops can be grown. I'm talking perhaps of some of the upland areas where it's sheep or maybe beef farming, and that's pretty much all they could do in terms of animal production. There could perhaps be some other possibilities for some other ecological schemes to make those businesses worthwhile. But I mean, it's not really on the table yet. So there's quite a bit of change to go through. And I know from my European experience that there's quite some common situations across Europe, although I think the common agricultural policy is also moving in the direction of how we reward farmers for public goods, payments for public goods, which is certainly the direction things are going to go in Britain as well. But it's going to invoke a lot of change in the next few years. And so I think the role for facilitators is going to be, or should be, increasingly on the agenda. Whether it will be or not, I think remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope that farmers will feel encouraged, and what we come out with at the end of the consultation process around what payments by results looks like, there is something for all. But I think you're right in as much that there are a lot of farmers who the kind of the space between where they are now and moving towards those kind of incentives is quite wide. I just wondered whether your thoughts on, if thinking about those farmers in particular, whether they value this process that we're talking about, which is essentially like a community of practice, isn't it? It's about farmers coming together to solve pertinent problems and issues in times of uncertainty, where innovation is really important. What do you think and I suppose if you don't feel that they necessarily value it at the moment or are not used to it, what do you think we could do? What's missing with regards to kind of supporting those farmers and facilitating that process?
I think there's a real variation across the farming community as to how ready people or farmers are for that. There are many that are in discussion groups, some facilitated, some not, and those farmers really find value in that, and they find support in that. But there are a lot of farmers that aren't part of really focused groups looking at change, and I think that's a bit the result of the way farmers have been pitched against each other for many decades. Really, there's just a sort of competitive nature of farming and not sharing, and there's been a culture around that, and I think we've got a lot of work to do to kind of undo that and encourage more sharing again, more collaboration, more partnerships between neighbours and land managers within the same landscapes or catchments. So in terms of what might help that along, I think my experience in working with a few groups to do with the Pasture Fed Livestock Association, we had a project funded by the Prince's Countryside Fund where we went into some of the poorer farming areas to really try and encourage a culture of sharing and collaboration to look at more sustainable methods of farming. It was very interesting experiencing the different cultures in different areas of the UK, and actually how a different facilitation approach was required in each case. And for example, in some areas, those farmers coming together in that sort of discussion environment in a facilitated way, it was very new to them, whereas in others it was they were fairly used to that sort of thing, and they saw the value of it much more quickly. So in those areas that were new to it, we really had to coax them along slowly and get some small wins early on for them to see that, actually it's worth going to this meeting because I'm going to learn something, and it's going to make me think, and that's going to help me with my business. So it again needs to be tailored, which I think is where the skills of the facilitator once again come in.
Definitely keeps coming back to the facilitator, doesn't it? So I'll certainly be advocating to policymakers around the importance and value of facilitation skills, and funding for that as well. I think it's really important in the UK for us to have funding pots for farmers to be able to go to apply for money to innovate together and form groups, whether that's self-formed groups that they facilitate themselves, or whether it's external parties who come in and provide the facilitation for them. I think going forward, that's going to be more and more important. And that's something certainly that Flynn, the Farm-Led Innovation Network that we're both a part of, is advocating.
Yeah, we must keep pushing on that though. I've had experiences this week. I'm part of a European focus group for sustainable beef, and we've been having discussions there about the role of facilitators. And I wouldn't say that across Europe there's a kind of universal appreciation and understanding of what facilitators' skills can bring to the change process. And I think there's a fair bit more work to do to show that. And I think that's partly a result of facilitation skills being in some ways, quite an art form. There's a lot of soft skills involved, and as we've discussed, there's kind of need for a tailored approach. And so it's not quite so easy for policy to kind of, I think, recognise what's required there, and that the outcomes of a funding injection could be a little bit of an unknown. Whereas if funding is put into a program or project with some very specific outcomes, these programs and projects do become tick box exercises to get to that outcome. Whereas within facilitation, good facilitation, you've got to be prepared for quite unexpected outcomes. And I think it's quite hard to justify that in a very structured way in policy terms. And so I think we've got more work to do to show the value of it, and value of just providing that facilitation and support, whatever may become of it, if you like.
Definitely. But I suppose going forward, certainly in the case for kind of environmental goods, not necessarily so much in the case of kind of animal welfare goods, the kind of agricultural regeneration that needs to happen across the UK in order for us to reduce climate change and regenerate the landscape is a not just local, but it's also a national response. So working together, not necessarily just locally with local farmers, but across the whole landscape to see how the picture develops and what we need where, that's certainly a collective response. And I can see how, so the process of not what individual farmers are doing on their individual farms is important, of course it is, but joining that all up will need some kind of, facilitated collective response and action about bringing farmers together in their local areas and looking at, for example, hedgerow belts and wildlife corridors and things like that. So, I think that policymakers do need to get on board with this idea of facilitation, because it's something that can provide a tool basically for what I see we need to help and support change.
Absolutely. And perhaps another barrier to it becoming a bit more accepted by policymakers is that the best way for farmers to change is for them to be empowered and lead it for themselves. And again, that's, is there a risk sometimes that, or is there a perceived risk that farmers could have too much power, and actually there's an interest in having a bit of control over what goes on, and it's a tricky one how it's going to all pan out. But I'm all for empowering the farmer and letting them drive the change and help one another, and having the facilitators to help it run along smoothly. I don't necessarily see that we're going to get all the leadership we need to address a lot of these challenges from policy or from government, unfortunately.
Okay, so I'm aware we could talk to each other all day, but I'm also aware that this podcast should have a finite time point. So just to wrap up then, Russ, it would be really nice to hear from you about what you're kind of currently facilitating and where you can see that going, particularly with regards to what we've just been talking about, in terms of facing into these challenges that we need to address.
So I stepped back from my role at the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association earlier this year in 2020, and I've been really focusing my time now on helping farmers and other farmer groups and other people actually in the supply chain as well, dealing with sustainable meat products. And so I've been trying to take a bit of an advisor / consultant / mentor role, but actually there's a lot of facilitation in there in terms of how it's a case of bringing people together, letting conversations run and evolve and see what becomes of it. And there's some really exciting things going on that I'm involved with now. I mentioned the European Focus Group for Sustainable Beef. I'm also helping to facilitate a group of organizations from around the world that are dealing with grass-fed certification programs and regenerative farming. And that's a network really for the organizations themselves that are then representing farmers, and we're over the internet now, which is so commonplace. We're learning a lot from one another, and again, going on a journey together. And that the reach of all those organisations is huge globally in terms of how they're helping farmers switch to more regenerative farming systems. And there's some groups also in the UK, some great stuff going on, some individual businesses that I'm helping, some of which are on at different places on their learning journey, but it's all really exciting because there's so much more appetite for change, not just because change is coming, but farmers are generally taking responsibility for the way that they farm and the environmental, social and economic impacts of the way they do things. So it's really good to see that movement growing and a groundswell of interest in new ways of farming. So it's all very exciting.
That's fantastic. That's brilliant to hear. The future is indeed bright. Thank you, Russ. We will draw it to a close there. Just before we finish, could you tell us how to get hold of you if people would be interested in contacting you about your work and what you're up to?
Yeah, sure. My email is russell.carrington@hotmail.co.uk, and I can be found on social media as @ciderruss, because I also make a little bit of cider in my spare time.
Jack of all trades.
Absolutely.
Thanks
a lot.
Cheers.
Bye.
The Arachnis project has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme under grant agreement number 817863.
Royalty-free music from Bensound.